I love this idea of Gestalt approaches to perception. This is similar to what we discussed in chapter 1, that reference to how we tend to see things and the way it's a bit immutable. For instance, among the figure ground or the Gestalt principles are figure ground organization. So a segregation of a whole display into objects, also called the figure, and the background is an important process known to cognitive psychologists as figure ground. So it contributes to some kind of cool illusions. This is from your text, but if you can see the people looking out into the ocean there, but you can also see the outline of the infant. So the idea is that when we confuse what is intended to be the background and make that the object of sorts, make that the figure, then in that case you have a really, really powerful illusion. There's some really cool ones out there. So it goes with the great artist, Salvador Dali. These are really powerful ones that bring out that idea of figure ground illusion. So it's one of those things that these immutable patterns that we have that, as your text describes it, one of the most important aspects of visual perception has to do with how we interpret stimulus arrays as consisting of objects and backgrounds. So with this Salvador Dali painting, obviously they're confused. And when they're easily confusable, you get, again, these powerful illusions. So understanding how parts combine into perceptual wholes was recognized as a central challenge in perceptual theory a while ago. For instance, here's another one. This is the subjective or illusory contours. I love an illustration like this because it's overwhelming. It's an amazingly strong impression that there's a triangle there. That white triangle just jumps off the page and it has decisive borders. And this illusory or subjective contours, this is a relatively complex display. It's subject to a simplifying interpretation that the perceiver makes without being aware of making it. You just can't help but perceive it that way. That's a really clever illusion. Now, there's just a million of them out there of subjective contours. But I think this one was the one that was used in the text, and it serves the purpose pretty well. So the Gestalt psychologists believe that perceivers follow certain laws or principles of organization in coming to their interpretations that just happen automatically. They're just immutable. immutable. They assert that the whole or Gestalt is not the same as the sum of the parts, and to put it another way, these psychologists rejected the claim that we organize or recognize objects by identifying each individual features. We take the whole thing, and it just can't be reduced. You're overwhelmingly inclined to do that. So here are some features that we did reference just loosely in chapter 1, I believe it was. The top one, principle of proximity. So in A, I tend to see 4 columns instead of 4 rows because the columns are grouped more closely together. In B, the principle of similarity. I tend to group by color. In C, good continuation. I tend to see one figure overlapping the other instead of two, a U shape and a line shape. Same with D. In E, the principle of closure. Now, strictly speaking, that square isn't closed. It's open, but we make it as a whole rectangle shape, even though the edges are rounded. And then F, the principle of common fate. So I wanted to elaborate on that. Where the heck did I do with it? The principle of common fate. Thanks for waiting. Sorry to keep you waiting. I had it right here. The fifth principle, the principle of common fate, is difficult to illustrate in a static drawing. The idea is that the elements moved together will be grouped together. So basically, with a static drawing, you can't really depict it, but if they tend to move together, so for instance, all the ones that are going downward would be grouped together. The ones that are going upward would be grouped together also. So they couldn't illustrate that very well here with this illustration. There's a couple other things I want to mention. Pomerantz and Portillo try to dig deeper into the principles underlying what makes a Gestalt. They focused on the property of emergence and perception, the idea that qualitative differences in a percept appear as parts are added, such as that wholes take on the properties that are novel and unpredictable and surprising. So among the things that we found is a configural superiority effect that's mentioned on page 49 of your text. And this idea is, if you'll just indulge, I want to read this paragraph really quickly. Although there are many good reasons to predict that it will take longer with composite displays to distract attention with some specific stimuli, the opposite results occurs. That is, perception of the odd stimulus out is faster in the composite stimulus display than in the base stimulus display, called this configural superiority effect. In fact, the second and fourth rows of figure 3-6 yield just such a pattern. The odd stimulus seems to pop out more dramatically in the composite than it does in the simple display. So here it is. Let me blow this up just a tick if it'll let me. I hope it will. Good job, Scott. So particularly, let's say in the top rows there, I've got the B stands out as an odd character out. The C's are all the same. But when it's a composite, basically I'm looking at the bottom right looking even more remarkable and sort of jumping off the page, as is the case in the second row especially. So those composites suggest that we're forming wholes all the time, WHOLES, and we have this powerful capacity to see things as wholes. And that's this composite superiority effect, that we're always combining things and making sense of it. But I hope you'll agree, and there's a million Gestalt approaches that I could show you that have grouping, that have principle of similarity, etc. And people tend to subjectively agree, yeah, I can't help but perceive it that way. It's not as though we were trained to do that in the first grade. It just jumps off the page in that way. And if you'll indulge me, I want to find one more. Some of these principles, particularly of subjective contours. Let me find one that's even more powerful. I got a little lazy, I guess. Be right there. Thanks for waiting. Should have had this ready. How lazy, Scott. Terrible. But here's one. Oh, I love this one. I used to show this in class all the time. Over here on the top right. Doesn't that just jump off the page at you? You see that cube that's inlaid among those black circles, and it just hits you over the forehead. I mean, you can't not see it. We have this amazing capacity to produce holes, but literally what is actually there is just a bunch of black circles with pieces removed from them. But the wholeness that we see is really, really powerful. And as you can see, a few other stray Googles here. I should have had this ready. But I just think that's the coolest thing. I really am a fan of people that thought to study these things. And I really can't wait. A little bit later in the semester, we'll speak of optical illusions. Why optical illusions tend to be so powerful. They draw on life experience, and they draw on these immutable ways in which we see things that are untrained, that are just reflexive. They're just as almost animalistic in the way that we see the world. So on to part 3 here in a second.